So look, that's A, the scheme, B, what it means, how to apply for it, and some key questions for employers, some key principles. That is also really the update in relation to everything that has come from the government in the last week or so. And now that the portal is actually open, we're seeing a lot more issues. But I'm going to stop there. We're going to now move into Q&A. A lot of you have sent through questions and answers, and we've begun to address those. And we'll take the next 20-25 minutes simply to deal with Q&A, which has arisen prior to this session or in the course of this session. So I'll hand you over to my colleague Johnny Simpson, and he will walk through certain of the Q&A already.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, so we have a few questions that have already come in, so we'll just start with some of those, and then I've seen that there's quite a few questions that have come through during the session this morning, so we'll try and get on to as many of those as we can. So one of the first questions, some of these will already have been dealt with to an extent in the presentation, but we'll run through as many as possible. Can you claim for workers currently on SSP, and what rate if the workers were put on furlough? So obviously we still need to comply with notification regarding placing an employee on furlough in line with other employees. Claims for full or part-time workers furloughed on return to work after a time off sick should be calculated against their salary before tax, not the pay they received whilst they're off sick. So yes, you can furlough them once they've returned from sick leave. You can't claim for both SSP and under the job retention scheme, but you can certainly put someone on furlough after that point. And then it's again the same if they're on variable pay, is using the same process for calculating 80% in those circumstances. So we have a query in relation to calculating 80% for employees whose pay varies relating to overtime payments. The government guidance tells us how to calculate 80% when pay varies, and tells us that it's based on regular contractual pay such as wages, compulsory commission, past overtime, and then it tells us to include regular wages that we pay, including non-discretionary overtime. So what is non-discretionary overtime? Is this guaranteed overtime? Effectively, yes, it would be more guaranteed overtime. The guidance is clear. You can recover the regular payments you're obliged to make to employees. So basic pay plus any non-discretionary elements and guaranteed overtime would be included in those circumstances, whereas non-guaranteed overtime wouldn't be included. We have a query in relation to the real-time submissions in relation to employees. Is there a new employee started work on Monday the 2nd of March 2020 and was paid on the 31st of March on the monthly payroll? An RTI was not submitted to HMRC before the 19th of March. The P45 shows a leaving date 27th of February. Are they eligible for the furlough scheme with the new employer? Unfortunately, no. In these circumstances, it would require an RTI to have been made on or before the 19th of March. So this is really an employer issue here. It's not an employee. In any event, you need to look at all the other eligibility criteria around the job retention scheme in terms of, have they been working, has there been consent in terms of placing them off, and what the employer has said. It would be open to an employer to agree with an employee outside of the job retention scheme to place them effectively on furlough, but then you would be unable to claim that 80% back off HMRC. You could have an arrangement with the employee during the time, but you wouldn't be able to claim those monies. Got some more that have come through as well. Bear with me. So we have a staff member who has two aspects of the role. One element is payroll, which still continues, but the other aspect of the role that makes up part of their monthly salary is event management, and that's now non-existent, which reduces their monthly income considerably. Can the event element of her salary be furloughed? There's no option under the scheme to furlough only part of someone's job or to decrease hours of an employee and furlough only an aspect of their role, like in that way. If an employee is placed on furlough, they can do no work for their employer during that period. So it wouldn't be possible to manage it in that way. There's another couple of questions here in terms of employees recruited on 1st of March, but not set up on payroll until the 20th of March. Again, I've addressed that in terms of some of the issues around making the RTI submission to HMRC on or before the 19th of March in order to be eligible. How can I be certain that HMRC will refund the wages I've paid out? That's going to relate to making the claim through the government gateway portal and making the submission, and then a payment should be made within 6 days. There's no indication yet about any queries coming back from HMRC on submissions. As long as all the other criteria have been made correctly on the gateway portal, it would be assumed that the payment will come through. Do agency workers have the same rights as employees under the scheme? We've touched on that briefly. Yes, agency workers can be furloughed, but it will be up to the agency to manage that and place them on furlough. So if you have agency workers but you've no work for them at present, then you would need to speak to the agency supplying them and make arrangements with them in terms of what you're doing. And it'll be up to the agency to then manage that. If a business isn't adversely affected by coronavirus but has employees who are shielding or have childcare responsibilities, can they furlough them? Gareth already touched on this. Yes, you can furlough employees who are shielding or who have childcare responsibilities. I suppose you need to be careful in terms of the reason for why you're making a decision to furlough them in light of the guidance around businesses who are being severely affected by it, and taking a view on that to ensure that you're falling within the scope of the scheme. Gareth, have you anything to add in relation to that point?
Which one, Johnny?
So it's if a business isn't adversely affected by coronavirus, but it has employees who are shielding or who have childcare responsibilities, can they furlough them?
Yeah. So yeah, we touched on that in the presentation. The employer may furlough in those circumstances if they are satisfied that the individual has received the NHS letter or the second round of the BMA approved correspondence from treating GP. The difficulty is that will bring with it an additional layer of potential scrutiny afterwards. So it's really hard to differentiate between employees, and this sounds harsh, but it's happening, employees who are genuinely ill and are genuinely shielding versus those who want to take advantage of the scheme. And we're seeing that quite a lot. And as a consequence, if practically you want to go through that and allow that individual to be furloughed, then in your employee consent, there will be a degree in eligibility criteria, which we are drafting in quite a bit. But in that particular circumstance, you will also need to say, if at any point HMRC considers that you were not in fact eligible, then that will be recoverable from you as a debt, or that will be recoverable from you from future wages, etc. i.e., it's easy for the employee to make the request. It's hard for the employer to refuse it because it seems inhumane. But if there is any potential challenge to it whatsoever, then the employer will be able to recover that, and you're making that point crystal clear at outset. That's for those applications which are in the grey area, because if someone produces the original form of the NHS letter and the name on it matches, the address on it matches with personnel records, etc., so that it is clear that the individual is within the protected category and they are living with the employee, then fine. We're seeing the difficulty whenever it's a pro forma letter, or the names don't match up, or the addresses don't match up, and they're saying, oh, will I now live with him since coronavirus? Well, that's a risk. So it's a tough area for employers to deal with. And as I say, it may seem inhumane what we're saying, but we've actually seen a lot of people seeking to abuse it. Thanks, Johnny.
No problem. Just turn now to some of the questions that have come through on the during the presentation today. Can we take employees on and off furlough? Yes, we've answered that. That can be done as long as you're bearing in mind the 3-week minimum period for placing an employee on furlough, and you're managing consents around that appropriately with employees. With any information on directors, what work we can do and if we can be furloughed. Yeah, we've touched on that as well in terms of the statutory duties that directors have. And there's need to really be very crystal clear with directors and employees that are being furloughed that they cannot work for the company, but in relation to directors where they have those statutory duties to fulfill, that should be constrained as far as possible. So got a couple of questions in relation to the furloughing employees. You know, some employer might have weekly and monthly paid employees, and you know, may have employees that were placed on furlough initially, and then additional employees who were laterally placed on furlough, and questions about issues claiming for the same period twice under the government gateway. So this seems to be a question about whether or not you can go in and make a claim for a weekly paid employee at the end of the next week, but then there's a monthly paid employee who will cover the same period. Based on the guidance, it suggests that you can only claim for a period once. It would be prudent to wait to the end of the month to then make the claim for those for all of the employees concerned. As far as possible, you can, I understand, claim through the scheme up to 14 days in advance of the payroll date in relation to the period. So you can then calculate it on that basis and hopefully have everything in order and process in advance of the payroll date, for example, in order to then make the payment.
Yeah, and just on that, that will create cash flow difficulties for employer and employee if the employee, for example, was used to being paid weekly. So I think the way the scheme works is, well, there is one period. It's not sophisticated enough to acknowledge multiple periods for each employer. So I think prudence, and it's easy for us to say, would say that you make one application at the end of the month for payroll, and if that is weekly and monthly, it sweeps up both. But what you should probably also do is notify all weekly paid staff and say, yes, you're furloughed. Yes, we've managed the payment for March. We might even manage it for all the weeks in April. But now that the portal is opening, we simply don't have cash flow to continue that, or cash reserves to do that. So instead, make sure that or understand that your next payment will be probably week 4 of May, 20th, 25th, whatever. We'll be making your application for furlough for that, and make sure that your standing orders, your direct debits, etc., are changed with your banks and building societies, etc., because for a short period of time until we normalize, you're going to be paid effectively monthly, not weekly. As I say, that will create cash flow difficulties for both, but that seems to be the best way to manage through the portal, because if you try and do it on a weekly basis, they're not going to accept that.
Okay, so I think, yeah, there's a series of questions in that vein. I'll just skip down through those. There's a couple of questions here in relation to government funded organisations. So we work in social care and are government funded. Are we able to furlough staff, for example, those who are shielding or can't work due to childcare issues? And another one in relation to a GP surgery where an employee is, their pay ultimately comes from the government. So there is guidance in relation to that, suggesting for the most part that publicly funded roles should not need to be furloughed. It may be the case, however, that in certain circumstances, those rules are, there's a different arrangement made outside of the job retention scheme in relation to the requirement to come to work, but it's not necessarily the case that they'll fall within the job retention scheme, given the public funding of the rules. it's going to be difficult in some organizations where the flow of government funding is more indirect, and you have to look at whether or not it's a almost a straightforward reimbursement of a salary through government funding, or whether it's more like a grant that will just happens to be paid out of. So there will be a number of considerations that you would need to look at on a case-by-case basis in those circumstances. So a question on annual leave and holiday pay. Are you saying that if an employee takes holidays, they are paid at the full amount? Can they be on holiday and furlough? I thought that by using the calculator yesterday that this was not accepted or allowed. So yes, as we've covered, the guidance does permit employees to be on holiday during furlough. It is just the case, however, that they will need to be paid at their normal remuneration, 100% of their normal remuneration for periods in which they're on holiday. So whilst under the job retention scheme, you might be able to recover up to 80% of their salary, you will need to top it up to the 100% in relation to any days which are taken as annual leave during the period. Okay. If at the end of furlough we find ourselves in a bad place regarding revenue and we have no choice but to let go of staff, can the employer do this? Yes, as Gareth mentioned, it will be very difficult and to know exactly what's going to happen in relation to the end of the job retention scheme, and how that will coincide as we come out of lockdown. It may be the case that businesses will be able to transition back into operations, but in certain circumstances, the economy and the impact of everything may be so negative that a business just won't have the cash reserves or the necessary income to maintain employees, and may need to look at compulsory redundancies at that situation. But the scheme does not take away the application of normal employment law principles. So if that is the case, just because the scheme is ending doesn't mean you can just automatically make an employee redundant at that stage. You'll still need to follow a fair process. You'll still need to consult with employees in relation to redundancy, and as Gareth has mentioned, depending on the government announcements and how things unfold, you may wish to start that consultation process before the job retention scheme does end.
I think on that as well, that's probably why the real reason why the government confirmed that the furlough scheme is extended to the end of June, because in England with collective redundancies it's a 45-day notice or consultation period, and 45 days from mid-April takes us through to the end of May. And I think they were really concerned that a number of employers were so fearful of how business was going to recover, or the fact that it wouldn't in lockdown, is that they were going to commence compulsory redundancy this week, the collective consultation process, and they were very fearful that that would create a huge amount of negativity and would impact adversely on us coming out of lockdown and recovery. So by giving an additional month of furlough scheme, most of those employers, if not all of those employers, will take a view, well, actually, okay, we're good for another month at least. So that holds off the collective consultation surge in GB. Now, that has only limited application in Northern Ireland because our collective consultation would be 90 days. So we just see that as an additional month's furlough for all employers to avail of. But for those employers who are in real difficulty financially, actually, with a 90-day consultation period, we need to be thinking and advising now in relation to potential concerns, and making sure that the consultation runs in tandem with furlough, as opposed to waiting to the end of it and then being exposed to a 90-day consultation period or pay in lieu. So if businesses are in very significant difficulty, even with this scheme, and are thinking about compulsory redundancies on the basis that no voluntary or suitable alternative can be found, then regrettably we really need to be looking at that now and communicating with affected employees now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So another question on the 3-week minimum period. Employee's been furloughed for a period of 3 weeks and then comes back. Is there minimum time before they can be placed on furlough again for another 3-week period? No. You can bring them back for a couple of days and then put them back on furlough again for another 3-week period. It's just that those days that they are back working for you, you will not be able to claim under the scheme. Recent government guidance states employers keep written record of placing staff on furlough, but written consent from employee not required. This is not aligned. Okay, yeah, there is a slight conflict in relation to where you look at government advice in terms of notification and keeping records and notifying employee placed on furlough. But in the Treasury direction to HMRC, which is made under the coronavirus legislation, which places it automatically on a much stronger and more binding footing, states that consent is required. So that is why it is important to seek those consents. I would also just highlight that yes, you may be able to notify employee on furlough, and there may be arguments around implied consent in relation to this, but in relation to specific claims for unlawful deductions for wages, where you're not going to top up the 80%, you will need to have consent in order for deductions from salary to be made. So that does again reinforce the need for consent, and that's why we would advise that consent is obtained. Okay. Can a resident of the Republic of Ireland but working in Northern Ireland, can they be furloughed? That's a good question. I think it'll probably depend on how they are paid through payroll and how they're registered with HMRC. If an RTI submission has been made to HMRC in relation to them, then that would seem to be fine. If they're not paid through that mechanism, then that probably would create issues, and they would not be able to claim in relation to their salary. I don't know if you've come across that issue at all, Gareth, yet.
No, we haven't, but I agree completely with what you've said. It'll probably go down to how the individual has been on PAYE and to which tax authorities they're already known. And the government's approach to RTI and PAYE on or by the 19th of March is going to be definitive. So in that situation, if an employer wants to put someone in or feels it's the right thing to do, then they of course can try, but they run the risk, like I've said in so many areas of this, they run the risk that HMRC will not agree, in which case you will have effectively you're left with continuing to pay it out, seeking to recoup it, and that makes for a much more difficult conversation then than saying to an employee, now look, on a reading of the rules, you're just not eligible.
Okay. What if you do have work available and an employee refuses to return to work from furlough due to caring responsibilities or living or caring with someone who is shielding? So yeah, this is something that we've come across in terms of both employees obviously asking to be placed on furlough, employees refusing to be placed on furlough, and then obviously the potential for employees who have been placed on furlough not to want to return. It's a difficult one in terms of managing the conversations with employees about the employer designation to place an employee on furlough, and that choice that rests with the employer, and then obviously trying to manage real concerns that people will have. However, ultimately, it could ultimately become a disciplinary matter if an employee is not fulfilling a reasonable direction of the employer to return to work. If they are shielding, they have the NHS letter or letter accepted in relation to their from their GP, then you would be looking at potentially taking a view and retaining them on furlough. You might wish to speak to the health and safety executive in relation to that from a risk, health and safety risk perspective, and conducting a risk assessment of your workplace in relation to having such an employee in the workplace. So there are a myriad of different considerations there in that situation, but it is one for communication with the employee first and foremost. I think. Gareth, have you any other comments on that type of situation?
No, other than it's really quite common, and your first port of call will always be the NHS BMA type correspondence. That should generally give an answer in relation to shielding criteria, etc. And other than that, it's as I said before, it feels fairly inhumane to do this, but the employee may want or may feel that they are shielding, etc., but technically they're not recognised as that by other government agencies. So if the NHS don't recognise that, then it's going to be a bit of a stretch for HMRC to accept that, in which case, as an employer, you run the risk of paying out and not being able to recover. The guidance on that is actually relatively straightforward. It is there, and even something like ACAS, and I know ACAS is the English equivalent of LRA, but they are clear that if an employee, when they have been given with all their choice, been communicated to effectively in relation to their choices and the employer interpretation of the scheme and the employer interpretation of eligibility, etc., if the employee doesn't go along with that, then it is a case for disciplinary action. So even the government guidance from an advisory agency like ACAS is quite stark in that. The designation decision making all rests with the employer, not the employee, and that's true for the portal or the gateway as well. The employee has no ability to contact or communicate or to petition. It is all to do with the employer election and the employer approach to this. That's why we have made the point over and over again. There's a distinction to be drawn between doing what appears to be the humane thing and acknowledging that if you get that wrong or HMRC disagrees with you, the employee is not going to be so badly affected because they will already have been paid out by you. But the business is the one that is taking on that responsibility financially. And the other issue with that is, for as long as this scheme lasts, if you make a payment in 1 month, that creates an expectation that you will continue to make that in subsequent months, even if HMRC don't agree with you. So you do need to be really careful about, finding the balance between doing what seems to be the right thing on a humane level versus taking tough decisions to sustain the business and make it last once we get through this.
Yeah, so there's a couple of other questions in similar veins. I think we've covered that off. Can an employee take another job while on furlough? Do they have to notify their employer or new employer? So yeah, we've covered that off to an extent in the key concerns. It is permitted for an employee to take another job. This will ultimately be subject to their contract with their current employer. Do they need to get consent before they do that, or are they actually barred from doing that under the contract? So that's the first port of call. In terms of notifying their employer, then that would be required. I don't think there's any other mention of notifying employers under the government guidance in relation to eligibility under the scheme, but yeah, they can certainly do that. Okay. Charity care provider, publicly funded. Yeah, so there's it's another question around the public funding issue. I think we've covered that off. Charities are eligible under the scheme, and you need to look at carefully in relation to how the government funding comes through and what you should be doing with that in relation to either maintaining services or looking at whether furlough is a possibility.
I'm just conscious we are coming to the end, and I want to hand back to Rodney in a moment to close. I suppose there's two things to be said broadly in relation to these questions. The government guidance is really important that everybody has a handle on that. There are a huge amount of commentators out there, and commentators are fine as far as they go, but they have to be remembered they're only commentary. The best sources are HMRC government guidance and then DirectGov guidance. And furthermore, a lot of the questions are becoming really very specific, and some of them are seeking a binary answer. And the problem is that as an employment law advisor, to properly advise that, you need to consider the whole contractual suite involved in a decision like this. JRS calculator, government gateway are only two elements. Now, they're the two major elements, but as the Chancellor said, employment law is not overridden by this. So we still have to go back, as an employment judge will do in 6 to 9 to 12 months' time, if any of these issues come up for challenge, and say, okay, fine, we understand the furlough scheme. It was a good scheme. It had teething problems, but broadly speaking, 6-9 months from now, we'll understand exactly everything we need to know about it. But their starting point will not be JRS. Their starting point will be, what did the employment contract say? What did the employment handbook say? Did the employer follow its contractual obligations? Did the employer follow its statutory obligations? And then when they look at the furlough scheme, did the employer follow the government guidance? So those are your 3 steps to answering most of these questions. Some of them in the heat of the moment will be all about the portal and how difficult it is. We totally get that. But also in terms of answering that, that is your step, is your pathway. Contract, statute, JRS and portal. And that will be helpful to a point. For everything else, to get into the nuts and bolts of this, you also need to consider what has already been said and done with the employee. What are they saying and doing? Is there any custom and practice in your organization? Are there comparators, etc.? All of those good things that employees and solicitors in due course like to draw out and use to criticize. And whilst you're in the heat of this, you have to try and balance all those various elements of the equation before we get the right answer. And I know that John and I have talked, and in one sense we are just another commentator, but we have done as much probably as we can in relation to the questions coming in, although we have said we will continue to look at any questions coming in and we'll feed those back through INI if that's of assistance. But I think on that note, I'll hand back to Rodney at INI just to bring this to a close.
Okay, thank you. That's our webinar almost finished. I would like to thank Gareth and Jonathan for their presentation today. We have tried to get through as many of your questions as we could. But if we were unable to get to your question, we will continue to update our business website, nibusinessinfo.co.uk, with the latest government guidance, advice and FAQs. If you would like to receive the latest news from NI Business Info, you can sign up for their email newsletter on the nibusinessinfo.co.uk website. We are also holding a webinar on the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme on Thursday, the 23rd of April at 11 AM. You can find a link to register for this webinar on the events section of the investni.com website. If you want to be notified of the latest events and webinars from InvestNI, you can get this by ensuring that you sign up for our 2-minute update email newsletter on investni.com, or you can keep an eye on the events section of our website. Today's webinar will be made available on investni.com later this week, along with the presentation slides. And I would just like to thank you all for attending today.